Hi, everyone. Welcome to the China and the Global South small group expert-led discussion of the 2021 EPIC Symposium. My name is David Zhang, and I'm a second-year student in this year's EPIC class who's studying international relations. Today's discussion, we'll look forward to discussing China's growing involvement in burgeoning relations in the LAC, Latin American and Caribbean, and African nations. China's relations with these nations have reached a high profile since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. However, actual relations between China and Global South nations are far-reaching and intricate in their historical breadth. The BRI is only a recent development. With China's plethora of infrastructure projects in a growing number of Global South nations and billions of investment flying around the world, we hope to delve deeply into the true impact of Chinese projects abroad. What is the situation like on the ground with social, economic, and environmental factors considered? Do China's projects provide tangible economic promise to the receiving country, or are they exploitative in the nation in which they operate? In addition, we hope to analyze the diversity of strategies taken by various nations interacting with China and the vastly different outcomes that result. So before I introduce our panelists, I want to explain how this discussion will run. So purposes of encouraging as much discussion as possible, after my introduction, each panelist will give an opening remarks of 5 or 6 minutes, and then I'll post a general question to get the ball rolling. And after that, we will see where the discussion takes us. We want a lot of back and forth dialogue, and we hope this will be very intellectually stimulating and engaging. So I'm joined today by 2 experts. So we have Ms. Margaret Myers, who's the director of the Asia and Latin American program at the Inter-American Dialogue. She established the Dialogue's China and Latin America Working Group in 2011 to examine China's growing presence in the Latin America and the Caribbean. Myers also developed the China-Latin America Finance Database, the only publicly available source of empirical data on Chinese state lending in Latin America, in cooperation with the Global China Initiative at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. Next, we have Dr. Emmanuel Matambo. Dr. Emmanuel Matambo is a visiting research fellow at the Center for Africa-China Studies. The center is a joint initiative of the University of Johannesburg and Nanjing Tech University. While at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, he published 2 dissertations about China-African relations, with his dissertation for a Master of Social Science degree based on the China-South Africa relation, while his doctorate dissertation was a constructivist analysis of Sino-Zambian relations. So while he has published many academic articles on a range of topics like conflict resolution, contemporary terrorism, African agency, his main interest is on the growing China-African relationship. So I will let Ms. Myers give her remarks first, followed by Dr. Matambo.
Thank you so much, David, and also for the kind invitation to join you all. It sounds like, just from what David said, the folks here in the room have some very fascinating backgrounds and a lot of sort of related interests. So I look forward to hearing about your interests, your areas of focus, and to having a really rich discussion for the remainder of the session. It's also a distinct pleasure to be joined by Dr. Matambo as well. I look forward to learning from him too. So as you know, as David mentioned, I've been at the Inter-American Dialogue now, which is a Latin America affairs, or actually Western Hemisphere affairs, think tank in Washington, D.C. for about a decade. The think tank itself was developed back in the 1970s to address the debt crisis in Latin America, bringing together key actors from across the region to come up with solutions to what at that time was a common issue and a pretty existential one for many countries. And since then has become, we've focused on a much wider range of topics. We have 5 different program areas, and one of them is Asia and Latin America. And I would say, I direct the Asia Latin America program. I came to the dialogue to do just that. And I would say that although it's Asia and Latin America, the title of the program, we focus probably about 80% of our time looking at China, just given the transformative nature of Chinese engagement with Latin America and how very much the relationship has evolved over the past 10 years, 2 decades really, but really in the past 10 years, we've seen some quite remarkable and dramatic evolutions. And another, 20 or so percent of time is of our time and attention is focused on mostly on Japan's sort of long-standing relationship with the region, which is also very interesting. And has become of renewed interest of late in Washington, D.C. For those who don't know, as the U.S. government, whether under the Trump administration or the Biden administration, looks to partner with what are called like-minded countries with shared values to try to offer alternatives. In terms of investment in certain strategic sectors to Chinese investment. This is just sort of the nature of policy at the moment. And so certainly the US-Japan-Brazil relationship, US-Japan, other countries in Latin America, triangular dynamics are of heightened interest in Washington at the moment, and so have been an area of focus for us as well. Our program, what we tend to do with the dialogue, and our areas of focus have actually evolved over time, just kind of given priorities at any given moment, whether in Latin America and China or in the United States. But what we've tended to do sort of since the beginning is to divide our work into three different areas. One is looking at the sort of macro relationship, what's happening, broadly speaking, in terms of capital flows, in terms of broad sort of economic trends, broad political trends. And as David mentioned, we started something called the China Latin America Finance Database. Gosh, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, to start tracking Chinese sovereign loans. So a very specific kind of loan, right, to Latin American governments and state-owned enterprises. And at the onset of this relationship, so much of what was happening in the financial space was indeed sovereign loans. China's big banks, I don't know how familiar you all are with the sort of, bank financial landscape in China, but there are two big banks, China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank, that do a lot of the overseas lending, or at least have historically, and continue to do so in support of the Belt and Road Initiative. And they gave, lots of money to a handful of countries in Latin America over time. So what we did was to track a lot of that. In addition to that, we try and track other sources of finance, commercial banks, for example. You've probably heard of ICBC, Bank of China, which are, present here in the United States to some degree, but are, especially prominent in certain countries in Latin America. For example, if anyone's been to Argentina of late and you've headed down to the river to Puerto Madero, you've seen a huge ICBC building that does a lot of work, both in terms of retail banking and giving money to companies of various forms to do projects in Argentina and elsewhere. And in addition to that, we track, developments in trade, bilateral trade, regional trade, and also flows of foreign direct investment, be it acquisitions of existing assets or greenfield investment, meaning building new things, right, in and across the Latin American region. Where is this headed? Is it changing? What are the sectors that Chinese companies are prioritizing? Why are they prioritizing them? Trying to get a sense of how all of this works. And also providing recommendations to Latin American governments to ensure best outcomes, right, with respect to these various investments and build capacity. On the micro side, we have been trying to understand a firm level dynamic. So what's happening within Chinese companies as concerns, for example, views of corporate social responsibility or governance, right, to potentially affect outcomes on the ground in Latin America? Is there a growing interest in engaging with local communities before or during project development? Which companies are performing best in the Latin American region and which are still struggling to meet certain standards? How do companies react to controversy? These sorts of questions are things that we have explored over time as part of the program. We've also done a recent paper, if you're interested in kind of in this world, right, in China, Latin America, or China's global engagement, called Going Local. And it examines the extent to which China is engaging at various administrative levels in the Latin American region. We've seen a lot of bilateral engagement really since the onset of the relationship a couple of decades ago. And just as a point of comparison, the Latin America relationship is about a decade younger, this enhanced relationship, right? China's been in Latin America for many, many, many decades, engaging in various ways, but this enhanced economic relationship really started a couple of decades ago, about a decade before, and Dr. Matambo can correct me on this, but about a decade before Africa's enhanced relationship with China. But in any case, we explored the extent to which bilateral engagement continues to be an area of focus versus regional engagement through various platforms that had already been in existence or are of China's design, like the China CELAC Forum, for example, which I'm happy to talk about. But also a growing interest. It's been ongoing for a number of years now, but a growing interest certainly in engaging at the local level. So with cities, with municipalities, with states or provinces, in order to advance a wide range of objectives, economic, right, commercial, or political in some instances as well. And more broadly speaking, sort of just shaping views of China across the region through a wide range of mechanisms and through wide-ranging actors. Some of them, official diplomatic actors, embassies, for example, others coming from various ministries in China, others sort of quasi-diplomatic actors, such as the CPA FFC, which is responsible for sister cities relationships, and others, right? All sorts of other networks that are being developed right now. And that's a big part, of course, of the Belt and Road as well. The Belt and Road has sort of 5 different areas that it focuses on, in terms of promoting connectivity. And one of those is people-to-people engagement, right? So that's certainly a big part of that. And then a third area that we look at as part of the program is this US, China, Latin America triangular dynamic, right? Which is a complex one. As the tensions in this relationship have really intensified quite considerably over the past, I'd say, 4 years, which probably comes as a surprise to no one, seeing any headlines of late, with real, concerns on all sides about where this is headed and what can be done.
Ms. Myers? Sorry, in the interest of discussion.
Yeah, by all means, I'll stop right there. Go ahead. Let's move on.
Delivers remarks. Dr. Matambo, the floor is yours.
I imagine we're in different time zones. It's 7:45 in the evening here in South Africa, Johannesburg. So good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. David, thank you very much. And thank you to your institution as well for your kind invitation. And thanks to everyone else who is participating in this meeting. Well, and I'm really honored to share this platform with Margaret Myers as well. I'm an admirer of what she does. And then most of what I'm going to say here could actually apply to what she was saying, because if we look at Africa in the developing world, then we would see that there are some intersections between what has been happening between China-Africa relations and what has been happening between China's relationship with Latin America. Now, if you would indulge me, I'll start by creating a context of China's relationship with Africa, and then cascade it down to China's relationship with my native country of the Republic of Zambia. Visit if you have a chance; it's a beautiful country. So I'll proceed in that fashion. Now, what informs this stimulated relationship between China and Africa? Because this is a relationship that goes back centuries, even when Zhang He, who was a Chinese expeditionary, a eunuch, Muslim actually, supposedly went to the east coast of Africa. With some porcelain have been found in Africa, centuries old porcelain, and then he was gifted with a giraffe to go back to China. But then the establishment of formal relations between China and Africa happened in 1956. With Egypt being the first country to establish formal relations with China. And this was a year after the 1955 Bandung Conference, or the Afro-Asian Conference, through which the developing world sought to establish some synergy and then some independence against the Soviet Union and the United States in their pursuit for global dominance. And then after that, of course, the mainland China itself had to make sure that it embarked on a diplomatic offensive so that it could wrest its recognition at an international level from the Republic of China, which is Taiwan, because Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government had fled to Taiwan after the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. And the biggest coup that China had, mainland China, that it was in 1971 when 35 African countries, I think it was 22 African countries, but I think they formed something close to 36% of the membership of the United Nations voted in favor of China being the recognized representative of the Chinese people and thus occupying the United Nations Security Council seat. The culmination of all that came in the year 2000, when China was growing in its economic profile, and it established the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, popularly known as FOCAC. And David made mention, of course, of the Belt and Road Initiative, or initially called the One Belt, One Road Initiative, which was established in 2013. So that is how this relationship has grown. And between 2003 to 2019, which is a space of about 16 years, China's investment, overseas foreign direct investment in Africa, grew from only 75 million to 2.7 million, but then direct flows increased up to 5.5 billion. And that was because of the bank that Margaret mentioned, the ICBC, the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, buying about 20% of the stake in the Standard Bank of South Africa, which is one of the biggest banks, not only in Africa, but in the world. So that is what has been happening. Now, coming to Zambia, you have to look at the history as well of China-Africa relations, and then in Zambia's respect, that it is a relationship that was steeped in ideology, because China was pivotal in helping in terms of material production and also propaganda, in helping Zambia to make sure that it helped in the struggle against colonial, settler, and apartheid rule in Southern Africa. And then in 1967 to 1975, China contributed towards building the Tanzania-Zambia rail line, famously known as the Tazara rail line. And then China, as a poor country at that, now that this is very important, China as a poor country at that contributed 500 million. Now, to put this in context, in 1978, China's per capita GDP was $156. And what people will not guess is that the per capita GDP of sub-Saharan Africa at that moment was 3 times better than that of China at $490. But still, this is a country that contributed towards Africa's struggle against colonialism. So that created this semblance of formidability between Zambia's relationship with China, because Zambia was very vocal in promoting decolonization in Southern Africa. And President Kaunda, the first president of Zambia, described this relationship as a relationship between all-weather friends. Now, increasingly, this relationship has become lopsided. Why? Because China's economic progress has been sustained over 40 years, but Zambia's economic progress has been fitful, and it has been declining since 2011. And you find a situation now where 30% of Zambia's external debt, we have an external debt, official statistics say our external debt is 11.7 billion, and 3 billion of that, which is about more than 30%. Let me just say more than 30% of Zambia's external debt is owed to China. And we have seen a situation where the Zambian government is all too eager to please the Chinese government. And of course, the investment has come in form of road infrastructure, airport building, and foreign direct investment as well. And that has had an impact on Zambia's sovereignty, Zambia's democracy, because everything that is against China is frowned upon by the Zambian government. And I'll be happy to talk about the aspects of what democracy entails in a country like Zambia, not only voting, not only media independence, and not only multi-party democracy, and how China has impacted on all those. I hope I have reached my 5 minutes limit now. Thank you.
Thank you both for your remarks. So just as questioning, you can question and whatever comes to your interest. I know we have some TLIP international delegates here, so if they have any specific questions to either Ms. Myers or Dr. Matambo, we encourage the dialogue. So I can jump into my first question. So this is a question that comes out. it's more specific to Ms. Myers, but I think that it applies to Dr. Matambo's case as well. So in her book, Dragonomics, How Latin America is Maximizing or Missing Out China's International Development Strategy by USC Professor Carol Wise, she claims that China's involvement in Latin America complements rather than threatens the presence of the United States, as China fills critical infrastructure gaps for its own interests rather than taking on usual Western positions in aiding emerging economies. So this could also, this question could go out to both of you. Do you agree with her assertion? And what implications, positive or negative, does this have for nations of the region as well as their agency?
I'm happy to take an initial stab at that.
Of course.
Yeah, I think the first point is one that you alluded to, is that China has a very different view of and definition of overseas development assistance, right? And it comes in different forms, but is also largely based on infrastructure-driven growth, right? And so we see that playing out across the world, right? Including in the Latin American and Caribbean region in considerable fashion. And indeed, the Chinese companies, have been exceedingly active in the development, especially of transport infrastructure, with a major focus, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, on ports, but also road and rail, electricity transmission, energy infrastructure, things of this nature, where, there are other companies involved, including US companies, right? But not nearly to the same extent. And often they don't have access to the same sources of the extent of finance, right? Especially low interest finance that Chinese companies have. So Chinese companies, broadly speaking, are in a better position often to engage and have more indeed interest in engaging, including in countries that are perceived to have a sort of more risky politically or economically profile. And so, yes, there is a sort of complementarity there, wherein, China is engaging in areas where the US is not. That said, I think we have to break it down by sector. Right. So in infrastructure, yes, there's quite a bit of complementarity, but there's quite a bit of competition in other sectors. And tech is one of those, right? Tech is one of those, and it's going to be increasingly an area where there's a lot of competition. If we're talking about 5G infrastructure, small cell technology, things like that, the US doesn't really have is it a horse in the race or a dog in the fight? I have these idioms, I can never get them right. But in any case, we don't have a supplier, right? The US does not have a supplier of these things, but many other countries do, or four other, right? Or four other, I guess it's three other than China, because Huawei has two major providers, ZTE or China has two major providers, ZTE and Huawei. But in any case, whether we're talking about telecoms, 5G, smart cities, cloud computing, surveillance tech, a wide range of other areas, there is a lot of competition, not just with US companies, but with European ones, Japanese and Korean ones, really using it. So I think it's really critical. I agree with Carol Wise, absolutely, and she's a good friend, but I do also think it's really absolutely critical to break it down by sector, because indeed there is growing competition in certain areas. Ag is another one where competition is really quite extensive.
Right. Thank you, Margaret. If I could just add to that as well. As Margaret has rightly put it, there are some areas of complementarity and intersection, especially if you look at infrastructure. For example, President George Bush came up with the Millennium Challenge, which was very pivotal in improving Africa's infrastructure. And China has looked at, in countries like Zambia, China has looked at sectors where, for example, the Millennium Challenge could not cater. These are areas such as the provision of good transport infrastructure, because the Millennium Challenge in Zambia's respect was mainly towards sanitation and coming up with an effective sewer network. Now, let us come back to other sectors as well, and other aspects of China's relationship with Africa and as against the West. Now, the fundamental difference is on a matter of engagement and the form of engagement. When we look at what is happening in terms of material terms, economics, infrastructure, yes, you could see some intersections, but the fundamental difference comes in when you want to look at the values and the principles of engagement. Now, you have a China that seeks nothing but order. And you have the United States that seeks nothing but freedom and liberty in terms of their values. So that is where the difference comes in. There are countries where China would go to and say, we're not going to disrupt everything that happens because we are very touchy about you actually disrupting our internal affairs. So that is what happens. So China has more of a cultural, relativistic way of engaging with Africa and the developing world. The United States has an absolutist way of engaging with Africa and the Latin America, thinking as though there are certain universal values to which we all should adhere. And that is where the difference comes in. But then when you look at things like engagement in terms of oil, in terms of economic development, in terms of infrastructure cooperation, China is really doing nothing fundamentally different from what the West has been doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the audience have any questions? Please raise your hands and I can call you.
Perfectly happy to talk about also bilateral relationships if there's a specific country of interest.
David, I had a quick question, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Oh, I call in Jason. You can go next, Alex.
Okay, great.
Floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, so thank you so much for both of you for coming here and just joining this discussion with us. So Professor Matambo. Matambo. Yeah, so you were mentioning how, like, you know, fundamentally, like with the projects, especially I guess with like sectors like infrastructure, like the US and China, they're essentially doing the same thing, but you know, the values are different. The US is more, you know, like, you know, valuing freedom and like making that like pretty absolute. And just based on my understanding, like a lot of like, for example, investments and loans from the US and Western countries, they have like the standard, like maybe like on human rights or like political system that like requires a country to like reach a certain standard in order to receive the loan. But the Chinese investments are much more relaxed about that. Just based on your understanding of like the current state of Africa, like do most countries like fit the standard of US investments or do they not? And if they like they do not fit the case, like if they do not fit the standard for US investments, then technically they could only receive Chinese investments. Then are they like, you know, like happily receiving Chinese investment because they need to develop, or it's like, no, we really want the US investment, but we just like cannot like ensure like our political system to be like democratic enough or like human rights standards to be high enough to receive that. And unfortunately, we have to take the Chinese money. Like if the countries they could choose, then based on my understanding, then they prefer the Western investments more than China. Is that the case?
David, do you want me to answer right away?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Jason. That was a deep question. For me to answer it fully, I'll probably need to write a book. Margaret talked about bilateral relations, and I allude to that now because what you talked about cannot be generalized in the aspect of Africa. So let's speak in general terms, though. I'll start by speaking in general terms. Since 2011, when Libya was invaded up to now, there has been a loss in democratic dividend in Africa because the African Union has been very unhappy with how Libya has ended up and the crisis just happening in the Sahel region. So because of that, we have found ourselves drifting even more into China's orbit. Now, when you talk about do we happily receive aid or investment from China? Now, that has to be on a country-by-country basis, and I'll give you two examples. I'll give you the example of countries that are actually neighboring countries, Zimbabwe and Botswana. Now, if you look at the aspect of Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe was forced into going to China out of necessity because of its disastrous intervention in the Congolese War, and then the ruinous land redistribution program, which actually incurred a lot of sanctions on Zimbabwe. So because of those sanctions, Zimbabwe was forced to go into China, not because it chose, but because it was forced out of necessity. Prime Minister Tony Blair, he kind of went against his own word about how the people who were the British occupants of Zimbabwe are going to be compensated. So when he backtracked on his word, Mugabe decided to seize the land from British descendants, and that is why Zimbabwe came under strenuous sanctions from the United States, from the World Bank, and from the West in general, and then it went to China. You have another country, and let us look at this. Zimbabwe is an authoritarian country. And then you have another country right next to Zimbabwe, which is Botswana, which is by African standards, it's a bad thing to say by African standards, but unfortunately we have to say that because the democratic dividend in Africa has been on a decline. But by African standards, Botswana could be described as a stable democracy. Now, Botswana has because of the 45 nature of its democratic institutions, it is in a position to actually choose whoever it wants to have close ties with, and it has chosen both sides, China and the United States. But Botswana has been more assertive. There's been a lot of agency from Botswana. That is why even when countries, bigger economies than like South Africa, for example, backward under Chinese pressure by refusing to give the visa to the Dalai Lama, for example, Botswana agreed to give the visa to the Dalai Lama. He ended up not coming because of exhaustion. So countries that are more democratic, but authentically democratic, are more inclined to assert independence in choosing who to go for, whether with the West or China. But countries that are more authoritarian, like Zimbabwe, Zambia is increasingly becoming so. Those are out of necessity being forced to have stronger economic ties with the People's Republic of China. I hope I've answered it exhaustively, Jason.
Yeah, that was a really great answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Alex?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So this question, first of all, thank you to both of our speakers for coming and discussing with us today. So going back to something that Mr. Matambo said, how China has more of a cultural way with engaging with Africa versus the US and a lot of the Western Europe maybe is more of an absolutist way. I was wondering if both Ms. Myers and Mr. Matambo could comment on what the West could potentially have to learn from China's engagement in the developing world, in the global South, and what the future could look like if the West chooses to adopt something closer to the Chinese model as China continues to invest more and more in these regions.
You can go first, Margaret.
It's a really great question. I mean, it's a really great question. It's a really important question. And I think actually, you know, observing the popularity, at least, you know, in the past, gosh, I don't know, at the height of Chinese lending, for example, to Latin America, which, you know, was in 2010 when we saw 35 billion being given by CDB and Exim Bank to Venezuela and Brazil and, you know, a couple other countries. I think there was a lot of sort of critical thinking in Washington, not just among US officials, probably less among US officials than among the multilateral development banks that are situated in Washington, you know, the Inter-American Development Bank, for example, and the World Bank, who, you know, which have very strict ESG standards, right, which they apply when giving loans, and which, you know, slow down processes quite considerably and make it difficult for them to compete effectively, right, for certain projects if they're going head to head to China and with China in certain cases, right, and also to get things just approved at all. And so there was a real sort of reckoning with this, as I understand it, right, at the time at the Inter-American Development Bank in particular. Should we downgrade somewhat, right, some of these standards in order to be able to engage more extensively with Latin American countries and to avoid losing some of this business, if we want to call it that, right, to China, or to avoid, you know, what they perceived at the time as you know, the ability to sort of influence outcomes as concerns, you know, the environment or you know, social welfare or governance in various forms and at different levels. They have not, as I understand it, downgraded any of their standards or guidelines. But this was something that they were absolutely considering. On the US, I mean, within the US government, what we see is, a response, a real sort of competitive response, which strikes me as a bit short-sighted. But I mean, a sort of initial response was the development of the BUILD Act, right, or the creation of that and the passage of the BUILD Act, which then led to the development of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, which has, at this point, I forget how many loans it is, but something like 6 or 7 have been issued across the Latin American and Caribbean region in a wide range of different countries, mostly supporting infrastructure projects of various forms. But in general, I mean, it's $60 billion globally, right, that the DFC is able to offer. It's slower, again, right, than what China tends to do. And the numbers really do pale in comparison to what China offers, whether we're talking, especially if we're talking cumulatively, like from the policy banks, commercial banks, from private equity funds, from, the wide range of other financial sources that are operating in these various regions at any given time. And so whether that's a response, it's good, right, to be potentially, doing more in the way of investment, but also there's the prospect of further indebting some of these countries if it's purely loans, right? And this was a bit controversial of late with respect to Ecuador, right, where the DFC, it's a memorandum of understanding. It's not something that's been signed off on yet, but offered a loan to Ecuador that was conditioned on the privatization of some oil assets and also on the rejection of Huawei as a bidder in the upcoming 5G auctions. So, there are ways to go about this. I don't know if that's the best way, but certainly these are some of the things that we've seen materialize, or the conversations and reactions that we've seen materialize in the past few years in response to all of this.
Thank you, Margaret. I'll just add a few words to what Margaret said. Thank you very much, Alexandra. That was a very profound question, actually, what the United States and the West, let me just say the United States and the West in general, could learn, if there's anything to learn from the Chinese model in Africa. The first thing is the acknowledgement of the different contexts. There's a different context between the United States, there's a different context happening in Africa, and there's a different context happening in China. Now, China seems to pay heed to those different dynamics. Now, Africa is at a different stage of development from the United States. If you look at the run up to the 1960s, the agitation for civil rights in the United States, there was a lot of exploitation that was happening to people of color in the United States. So most of the things that Africans actually today talk about is, well, you are forcing a paradigm on us that is not really suited to us, because you are it's more like a Procrustean bed. The United States wants Africa to, Professor Mkandawire, the late, says Africa should run whilst everyone is walking. I think the United States actually wants Africa to even fly whilst the rest of the world is working. And I think that cannot work. You have to understand the dynamics that we have here in Africa. We're at a certain stage of development. We're still trying to play catch up. And the United States has to make sure that it takes us at that level. Do not come up with this absolutist way of looking at the world. Make sure that you also consider the dynamics of individual African countries. And then another thing is, there is an expression, do not shoot the messenger. I think it's an American or Western expression. Well, here in Africa, when we look at our colonial history, unfortunately, you cannot disentangle the messenger from the message. So most of the times, for example, in the United States and Britain, France, and other previously colonial powers are pontificating to us, we always look at the person talking about that particular, giving us that particular message. And China has been very deft in that, because most of the times when China is engaging with the developing world, Africa in particular, it will always evoke the history of humiliation. China always talk about it being humiliated by Japan, it being humiliated by the Soviet Union, it being humiliated by Great Britain that only gave it back Hong Kong in 1997. So that creates this intersecting history of victimhood between China and Africa. And we look at now the capitalist world as being their common enemy. So that is, those are just some of the things to which the United States should pay heed. Look at the individual context of African countries, the cultural context of African countries, and pay heed to that. Do not, once you come as as a power that was previously linked to colonial powers, and you're just pontificating to Africa, we tend to look at more the person that is saying those things rather than the message that they are conveying. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk to us today. I have two questions, and the first one is like related to sustainability as well. So China, like although they are like investing in like energy, the coal plants and other like energy infrastructures, like they're also kind of like preventing developing countries from like developing sustainably. So what would be like the perspectives of like African countries or Latin American countries on like the balance between the sustainable development and economic like development in the short run? And my second question is, it's also related to economic development, but so China is investing more on like infrastructures, but like they are not providing much humanitarian aid compared to other countries like the US and or other like major European countries. So how do you see China will will China continue to focus more on like maybe investment on like infrastructures because it will promote like China's economic, it might be beneficial for like China's companies itself, or how would you see China will put more resources on like humanitarian aid, if you have any ideas?
I can make a few sort of brief comments to start out. So China just put out a new white paper on development assistance, which is worth, you may have already taken a look at that, Ria, I don't know. But, you know, it talks about more of a focus on humanitarian assistance and untied aid. So, you know, the provision of concessional lending, for example, or low interest rate lending that is not tied to the use of Chinese companies or to specific projects, or, you know, or to the use of Chinese equipment, things of this nature. So it's sort of rethinking of what it is to engage in development assistance in various regions, right? I don't know if that will fundamentally change this extensive focus on infrastructure development. I still feel like, you know, the view of what it is to do to do development assistance is very much, you know, infrastructure based, and that's unlikely to change all that much. But the nature of the ways in which they may go about that, the mechanisms used could vary somewhat in the coming years. So I think it might be worth taking a look at that particular document. I haven't studied it in a lot of depth, and perhaps Matambo, Dr. Matambo has and could provide some more information. But on the, you know, on the sustainability question, this is something that strikes me as sort of evolving, right? Quite a bit, at least rhetorically, right? It's hard to say whether there will be major evolution on the ground. Still, you know, in the Latin American region, I can speak only about that region, right? We're seeing considerable investment in sectors that tend to have an outsized, you know, impact on the environment and on, you know, social well-being, welfare, or, you know, on specific communities where some of these investments are taking place, because, you know, most of the focus is on extractive sectors and on large-scale infrastructure projects, including through, you know, areas that are environmentally very sensitive. And so, you know, undoubtedly there will continue to be sustainability problems associated with those sorts of projects and the extent of engagement in those particular sectors. At the same time, we're seeing in policy documents, a lot more of a focus on sustainability, a lot more of a focus on sort of greening the Belt and Road Initiative, on what's called quality infrastructure, which is a term that Japan uses extensively too, right? That China appears to have borrowed from Japan in just the past few years. But, you know, also, and on, you know, much higher standards and much more rigorous approval processes for overseas investment through the Belt and Road Initiative by Chinese companies. And so, a lot depends on whether these new initiatives, you know, have any teeth, whether they are, you know, upheld and whether Chinese companies go forth with all of this in mind. And that's hard to say, but things could change, and right now, according to China and some other studies, there's quite a bit less focus on coal than there has been in the past. So that's a power plant development, globally. Whether this continues to be the case, again, still remains to be seen.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for that, and thank you for your question. I can only pronounce your last name. Is it Takemoto? But your first name?
It's
How do you
Rie.
pronounce?
Rie.
Rie. All right.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Rie, for that question. Let me start with where Margaret left in terms of infrastructure. I say your question is not only a good one, but very important, because whenever we talk about the issues of how sustainable China's projects are, we shoot at the wrong target, especially here in the developing world. We are very quick to, and the West has helped us in that road towards era, actually. We are very quick in blaming China rather than putting the responsibility on China, on Africa and the developing world, because we know exactly what we need. We know how sustainable China's investment could be and how we could make use of China's investment in order to sustain what is happening. I'll give you a specific example of my own country, again, Zambia, where we have a desperate lack of electricity. These days in Zambia, it is not actually unusual to have a power outage of about 12 hours in a day. That's half a day in total darkness. So how do you industrialize your economy, for example? So in order to remedy that, we hired Sinohydro, a Chinese company, to build the Kafue Gorge electricity supply station. Well, that was halted in 2018 because Sinohydro could not actually explain why it had halted that, but it was probably because there was no assurance from the Zambian government that it could actually service the date that it had incurred from that particular area. So it is the responsibility of Africa to ensure that whatever is invested in Africa is sustainable. So the responsibility is on Africa and not on China. When it comes to humanitarian aid, I think the strongest point about China is actually its candor. It is very candid when it's coming to Africa. It does not come under false pretenses. If at all there are some negative aspects to China-Africa relations or China's relationship with the developing world, then those are kind of byproducts, but not that not that it actively seeks to undermine democracy or to undermine the local economies, as it was the case during the Cold War, for example, when the United States actually actively undermined democracy in countries like the Congo DR, provided you are against the Soviet Union. China does not do that. It comes as a strictly business partner to Africa. And so we know exactly what we're getting ourselves into. China does not tell us, okay, we are going to promote good governance in your country. We are going to come up with all, they do not use all this flowery language. They'll tell you this is exactly what we want, and we are going to go into it. And in terms of humanitarian speaking, when Margaret in her opening remarks was talking about the micro level, she was talking about community social responsibility. Well, that has been slowly coming into the mainstream of Chinese investment in Africa. For example, you have the Kajiado project in Kenya, where China, the Chinese company, a private Chinese company, is providing potable water to the Maasai people. Not only that, it is also embarking on building schools, coming up, teaching people fish farming and stuff like that. So that is happening, but not at a scale that the West has been doing. Thank you.
Frankie, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you both so much for being here and for such an insightful discussion. This is sort of jumping off of what you were just talking about and Rie's question. So from your perspective, how should both China and the US, how should their approach to foreign aid and investment in Latin America and in Africa, how should it change to best support economic development? Should it change at all? What industries are the most important to support? What form should this economic support take? And also in that, what is the role of international institutions? What is the role of the World Trade Organization, for example? Is there one? Yeah, thank you.
I'll let
All
you
right,
go first on that one.
all right. Thank you very much, Frankie, for that question there. In terms of what their approach should be, um, for a long time, and I think this is also happening in a way that that China has been cooperating with Africa. So there is a certain level of condescension really when a lot of actors come to Africa, and that has been detrimental to the continent. Every time, everyone always feels as if no, we have to go and help Africa. That is why sometimes if you look at the first two documents of the on the forum on China-Africa cooperation, it was about how do we develop Africa rather than how do we help Africa to develop itself. So I think that is how the approach should be. And then if the rest of the world is held to certain standards of governance, then I think Africa should be held to that particular standard as well. And I know this is very problematic because then China will say we do not want to interfere into the internal affairs of Africans. But then that only happens when you are dealing with Africans at a political level. The political elite of Africa will be very happy if we continue with what has been obtaining since the end of the Second World War, where you are just dealing with the elite, give them money and you don't care really about ordinary Africans. But if you are engaging with Africans holistically in a situation where you actually care about the plight of ordinary Africans, then the approach has to change. It has to be an approach that also caters for what happens at a subnational level, not only at a state level. And that will mean engaging more in the provision of effective education in Africa, the provision of healthcare, and the development of civil society organizations in Africa. I think that approach could be adopted and it could work well. And that has been a very big blight on China's engagement with Africa because it only engages mostly with the African elites. That's why you find that it has had close relationships with very obnoxious regimes, repugnant regimes such as the Zimbabwean regime and the Sudanese regime. What is the role of international institutions? Well, international institutions such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organizations could have a pivotal role to play, but then these are institutions to which Africa and the developing world are actually left at their mercy. Because who controls the World Bank, realistically speaking? Who has more influence at the World Trade Organization? It is the same powers to which we have to go and protest when they're engaging with us in a way that is kind of lopsided and not to the benefit of Africa. So that is a very difficult question. And in all honesty, I'll tell you there is a role that Africa could play through the African Union, but and of course that will have to proceed from how Africa wants to engage with China. Do we engage with China as Africa, or do we engage with China as individual African countries? And then if we go at that level, then we'll see that realistically speaking, Africa will not have the chance of engaging with China at a level of equal, at a mutually beneficial level, because China has 1.4 billion people, Africa has 1.3 billion. So already you see that even China's economy is greater than Africa's 1.3 trillion economy. So all those kind of things, they just realistically tell you that there can never be a relationship between two equals unless, as an international institution, the African Union chooses to engage with Africa at a continental level.
I'll just, that's a fantastic answer. And let me just underscore a couple of things that Dr. Matambo said that, look, I mean, pretty much every development organization, multilateral development bank, regional institution at this point has noted that the infrastructure deficit in Latin America and the Caribbean is extensive and is limiting prospects for development, in the near, medium, and long term. And so, I mean, it stands to reason that, well, first of all, obviously, China has identified this as a critical problem for Latin America, as a critical problem previously for China, and one in which China might be able to engage more extensively with some degree of mutual benefit, and has done so well. But there are, and the US has not engaged as extensively in the past in sort of hard infrastructure as part of its development assistance profile. And indeed, education, health, other forms of infrastructure, water and sanitation, for example, which was mentioned earlier, have featured far more prominently in the US's, ODA in Latin America and in a wide range of other regions. That said, there's good infrastructure and there's bad infrastructure, right? Not all infrastructure is the same and has the same effects on development outcomes. I mean, if we look at Argentina, for example, China during Christina Kirchner's presidency decided to support through China Exim Bank the development of 2 huge hydroelectric dams in Christina Kirchner's home province, wherein her associates were the benefits, derived the benefits of pretty much all of that work. Her friends got the contracts to both do the initial studies and also to construct the actual thing, and this is the sort of thing that we see happening all over the place. And the actual need for those dams was also heavily debated within Argentina. They're very, very far from Buenos Aires. It costs a lot of money to transfer that electricity there. And there are a number of dams that would have been better use to Argentina had they been constructed instead of these 2 sort of pet projects, right? Is what many people in Argentina have called them. So, it's a matter of thinking, very of doing some critical thinking, right, about how best to approach infrastructure, whether we're talking about the U.S. doing it or China doing it or anyone else, and also engaging in a lot of capacity building, right? And I don't see China doing this. I don't know if there's a lot of interest in China doing this or among Chinese officials in doing this or not, but certainly there's growing interest in the U.S. in helping Latin American countries, and not just countries and sort of institutions that are responsible for accountability and for managing procurement processes and other things associated with sort of deal making, whether with China or with other countries or companies, but also, as Dr. Matambo mentioned, strengthening civil society's capacity to monitor what's happening on the ground, whether it's China related or otherwise, and to hold companies, and others accountable for practices that may not have an overall positive outcome in the end. So that's a big part of it. I don't see the U.S. fundamentally changing its ODA profile at all in the coming years, but I do think that infrastructure, at least within USAID, there's more talk about including hard infrastructure as part of some of the outreach that the U.S. is doing, and this is indeed very much in response to China's model.
I think we have time for one more question, or perhaps 2, depending on the time. But Colin?
Hi, yeah, thank you to both of you for coming to speak with us today. My question was also, it's about like sustainability of Chinese investment, like through the BRI and other ways. So I used to live in Ethiopia, and in Ethiopia, there's like a lot of Chinese investment, and you would hear often stories of Chinese companies receiving like special exemptions from certain things, so it's just cheaper for their companies to operate, and so it kind of creating like a distortion almost of like a fair market. And so my question is about that. It's like, to what extent does Chinese investment like in the long term, does it like benefit like the market of the recipient countries, or is it gonna create more problems, more distortions in the market, such like that, and also maybe like to what extent does like the Chinese investment like disproportionately benefit more like elites versus people. I think like it obviously does provide economic growth, and that's good. I'm just wondering, like, is there like some sort of balance there? Thank you.
All right. I think I could go first on that one, Colin. Thank you very much for that question. When you look at Chinese investment in Africa, and to the extent to which it is benefiting recipient countries, I think the jury is still out on that, because when we look at its engagement with a continent, it is still at a nascent stage, and then it is very difficult in a space of 20 years to really gauge whether or not this will be sustainable. But there are, of course, opportunities for growth between in terms of China's relationship with Africa, and that is in the skills capital. Now, here we have a continent that is the youngest continent. We have an abundance of human capital. If only, and this will link to your second question, by the way, about the elite. If only China could try and benefit more the human capital of Africa, but of course that will have to be the primary initiative and responsibility of African countries themselves. So there are certain sectors, for example, in the provision of water, in areas like in Zambia and in Kenya, where hydro technology from China could actually help to alleviate Africa's problems when it comes to the provision of potable water. When it comes to the digital migration in Africa, although it is coming, it comes with all sorts of with all sorts of stereotypes, because people are generally skeptical of Chinese technologies, people from the West. But then, if you come to digital migration, for example, in Zambia, Topstar has been very instrumental in helping the Zambian National Broadcasting Company to migrate from analog to digital transmission of air. So that is an aspect which China has actually benefited a recipient country. When it comes to the level of the elite, I will more or less repeat what I said again. Disappointingly, what has been the case is that state level interaction has been to the detriment of an ordinary African. And there is actually a strange twist to that. A lot of African flawed democracies in Africa are actually drifting towards China, which is ironic, because a lot of people think if you're an authoritarian country, then you should go to China rather than rather than if you are democratizing. But then what has been happening is that there has been a reductionist view of looking at politics in Africa and democracy in Africa. What the West promotes in Africa is not really democracy, it is just voting, periodical voting after 5 or 4 years. So you find a situation where governments with flawed elections, knowing very well that they are going to be voted in at the behest of their people, even if the election is flawed, they'll want to go to China because China gives them readily available infrastructure development programs, and they can easily go to the people and tell them, well, there was no road here, there's a road today here, and Africans would go well and vote for that, especially if you're voting not only looking at the sustainable nature of that. So all that as well is tied up to this emphasis on relations with the elite, catering to the elite, to the detriment of ordinary Africans, people as we call them.
David, is there time for me to respond, or?
Yes.
Oh,
go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I would just, in the case of Latin America, I would just say that the jury is also still out in terms of the overall, economic impact among, a wide range of populations, largely because, again, this is a very young relationship, and so many of the larger scale projects are still either being developed, in negotiation or under construction. And the ones that are not, have been in existence for not all that long. There are a few that have been highly controversial that are built, like the Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam, for example, in Ecuador, which is one, the benefits of which are hotly debated, including by Ecuadorians. But nevertheless, yeah, the jury is still out. One thing I would say, you mentioned, that there may be some sort of market distortion, or that Chinese companies may benefit from subsidies or preferential access to finance or things of this nature that make them more competitive. And indeed, that is the case. And you hear European, not just US, but European companies just fretting about this constantly, like, how in the world are we going to compete in the Latin American market anymore, especially in certain industries. The concern is, I mean, usually they're going for projects that are needed, right? These are projects that the Latin American countries have put forth. They want a 5G network. They want a smart city. They want, somebody to buy this asset, all of these hydropower projects that this other company is leaving behind because they need to leave the market. So it's not as though they're coming in and forcing new projects on the region. But the concern is that there'll be outsized Chinese influence in certain sectors. For example, in Brazil, I mean, a considerable portion of Brazil's electricity distribution market is owned by China. Same in Peru at this point in time. And I mean, the question that a lot of people are asking, especially the defense community in the United States, is, whether this will lead to some sort of leverage over decision making on a wide range of issues, whether they are related to human rights or internet governance or, Taiwan or whatever it might be in the future. Whether that's a valid concern or not, I do not know, but that's something that a lot of folks are asking at present.
I think we can go for one more question. Anyone in the audience to raise their hand? Okay, go ahead.
I think I might have just missed it, but Miss Myers, is it how I pronounce it? I just want Myers. Sorry, I just wanted to ask about the growing local. Was that the word? For like China's policies in developing countries, like what does it mean to kind of like focus more on like local instead of even maybe like investments or like doing major projects in Latin America.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, the Going Local report is more focused on sort of activity by Chinese entities of various sorts, right, at the local level. So much of the relationship, over the past decade or two, right, has been at the bilateral level, a lot of negotiation with actual presidents, right, or officials, sort of central government officials, in terms of striking deals. And that still continues to be the case in certain countries where that model, actually tends to work out for China. There's also been a real extension of activity or focus on engaging regionally, right, through regional platforms. But also, I would say in the past 5 years in particular, an extensive focus on engaging also at the local level. So making really critical connections with officials in cities, in provinces, in states. Different Latin American countries some have states, some have provinces, right? But in any case, at various administrative levels, in order to be able to advance certain commercial objectives. Sometimes it's easier to, negotiate a new solar park with the officials in Jujuy province, Argentina, than it is to do so with the, Mauricio Macri government in Buenos Aires. Or to try to strike a lithium contract in Chile with a local entity than it is to do so. And a lot of this depends on how decentralized the governance structure is in any country and how much authority local level entities have over commercial decision making or other forms of decision making. A lot of this is also related to sort of just broadly improving views of China among broad sections of the population in a lot of these countries. So there's a lot of outreach, network building at the local level. That's a rather new, at least in Latin America, a rather new feature of the relationship.
So would you think it would be like beneficial, like also for maybe the locals in developing countries, not just like China, just as like mentioned earlier?
Will it be beneficial to them if China does this more extensively? Yeah. It could be, but again, it depends on the nature of the project, right? And the way that it's struck and whether there's sufficient transparency and accountability, and it's actually something that the region needs rather than, something that an individual leader is proposing in order to perhaps secure re-election. There are a lot of factors at play. So the quality of the deal, the way that it's struck, the sort of structure of institutions locally, and just how strong they are and able to hold various entities accountable.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I think that's just about all the time we have today. I just want us to thank our speakers for their insights and everyone who's joined us today for this conversation. We hope to see you tomorrow on the second day of the symposium for some more lectures and some more interesting breakouts. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Great moderation, David. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks, that was great. Thanks.
Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks.